I'm Daniel Penny, and you're listening to Non-Toxic, a podcast where we connect the dots between the manosphere and the atmosphere. Where does your crazy climate-denying uncle come up with the insane talking points that he trots out at Thanksgiving or Christmas? Things like, wind turbines cause autism, whatever he's saying probably isn't something he himself made up. In all likelihood, he's been watching too much YouTube, right? That's where so many people are exposed to climate disinformation. But the specific talking points that people use have actually changed a lot in the past 5 years, as Callum Hood from the Center for Countering Digital Hate explores in a new paper. And what I found really interesting talking to Callum is that there are really kind of two eras of climate denial. Old denial, which is the head in the sand, climate change isn't happening, or climate change isn't caused by humans, versus something a lot more pernicious and harder to combat, new denial. And in this conversation, we get into how it is that climate deniers changed their tactics, what external conditions they're responding to, why manosphere influencers are becoming climate deniers, as well as the financial incentives for spreading it, and the role that tech platforms have in combating climate disinformation. It's a great conversation, and I'm thrilled to have Callum back on the show. Callum, welcome back to Non-Toxic. It's so good to have you. You were our debut guest, and here you are again.
Thank you very much. It's good to be here on season 2 and enjoyed our chat last time. So looking forward to this as well.
The reason I brought you back, besides the fact that you were one of our most popular guests, is because your employer, the Center for Countering Digital Hate, just came out with a very interesting new report that felt completely appropriate to discuss on Non-Toxic, which is based on an analysis of thousands of hours of YouTube videos featuring climate denial content. And I thought, okay, this is something I need to dig into and discuss a little further.
You're our target audience, basically, yeah.
And basically, the report concludes that we've entered a new era of online climate denial, that there was this old era of climate denial rhetoric, and now there's something distinct going on. Can you explain what that distinction is? What was old climate denial and what is new climate denial?
Old denial is your really traditional, sort of straightforward climate denial, the archetypal, it's not even real sort of arguments. And new denial is attacks on the solutions, claims that the impacts are actually all fine, and attacks on climate scientists and members of the climate movement. And when we got data out of this study, we saw a really clear shift since 2018 towards that new climate denial.
What was the nature of this shift?
We looked at in the 96 YouTube channels, and they are what we've called denialist YouTube channels. They were basically YouTube channels that we had some reason to believe have promoted or held to climate denialist beliefs in the past. So it's a fairly decent sample, just shy of 190 days worth of YouTube videos, and stretching from 2018 to 2023. I think it's the first time we've used an AI classifier in such a substantial way. It would be cruel and unusual punishment to make someone sit through 190 days of content from these channels. But because we have transcripts, you get those transcripts, break them up into paragraph-sized chunks, which is what this AI model likes to work with. When we took the entire set, the trend was absolutely clear. It used to be in 2018 about 2/3 old denial, 1/3 new denial, speaking roughly. And that has basically flipped in 2023. This speaks to something that, we've talked to lots of other organizations working on this. There was this anecdotal sense that something could change. And this piece of work was intended to actually go, well, let's quantify it exactly in what ways has it changed?
There's been a flip from 2/3 old denial, 1/3 new denial to now 2/3 new denial, meaning not denying the outright existence of climate change, but attacking it on other fronts, saying, the impacts aren't that bad, or the solutions are unworkable, or the scientists can't be trusted. What do you think accounts for that change? Because that's a pretty dramatic change in just 5 years. Is it just that people, you know, are having a harder time denying reality? People go outside, it's weirdly hot, storms are really bad, droughts, fire, like they just can't kind of bring a snowball onto the floor of the US Congress and say, see,
Yeah.
it's cold,
Yeah.
which really happened, by the way. This is a clip of Senator Jim Inhofe on the floor of the Senate in 2014.
In case we have forgotten, because we keep hearing that 2014 has been the warmest year on record, I asked the chair, you know what this is? It's a snowball. And that's just from outside here. So it's very, very cold out, very unseasonal. So here, Mr. President, catch this.
Okay, well, that's fantastic. We tried not to, in the report, lean too hard into making big pronouncements on exactly why this is, because there's matters of sort of public opinion that might affect it. You can see this somewhat, I believe, in public polling. There is a greater belief in climate change. And certainly people, I think, have more of a lived experience of it now. They can see that even in their own lifetimes, the climate, the weather year to year, the seasons don't work like they used to. So that was something people were saying before we did this report. And when we look at some of the categories of old denial that fell most sharply, it's exactly your congressman with the snowball thing. There was a really sharp decline in the volume of claims that actually the weather's cooling and actually maybe these things are cyclical, that we're going to enter an ice age, which, seems ridiculous, right, to even say it. But that those claims were much more common earlier in this data set. I'm only talking about 2018. And so that's one factor. However, the reaction to the report was really interesting to me. So the Heartland Institute did a whole podcast episode about it, which was a very rich experience to listen to.
People like me and others at the Heartland Institute, we've never said that global warming isn't happening.
But then you've got people like Vincent Gray, an important climate denialist and pseudoscientist, speaking at the Heartland Institute's first international conference on climate change held in New York in 2008.
Well, here I am. I'm a scientist, and here I am amidst in the politics section, and I have a title which scares everybody because they have had to change it. They don't like the idea that the whole thing is a scam. They took all the title, the Global International Agenda. But it is a scam, folks, and it is a shame. It is, in fact, a surprise to me that many of you don't even seem to realize it.
But anyway, as the Heartland Institute was saying,
everybody knows global warming is happening. So that's a complete red herring. And then the idea that, we actually continue to still say that human activity is not causing a climate crisis. That's a basic staple of the messaging of climate realism, and the Heartland Institute continues to say it.
They were at pains to insist that they had never really denied that climate change was happening. I mean, according to the data, that's exactly the sort of stuff they promoted. And, there's lots of work done by, organizations like DSMOG cataloging what these guys have said for years. They have in the past promoted pretty blunt forms of denialism, but the fact that they are now at pains and spend a lot of time in the podcast saying, "Oh no, we know it's real," I think says something has changed. But even more interesting was in the Heartland Institute's podcast. What they argued was actually the shift in this data set in the report. They suggest because it's in this period that big policy proposals like the Green New Deal were being proposed, or more recently, the Inflation Reduction Act. And we have to respond to that. And we have to spend all our time now, picking holes in those policies.
I was going to ask, is it just the fact that, 2018, obviously Trump is still in office, and 2020, Biden comes in, And, there's the failed Green New Deal, but ultimately the Infrastructure Reduction Act. And in the UK, there was talk of a Green New Deal up until very recently when Keir Starmer reneged on that. But yeah, I think that those two, big policy proposals, if you're on the right, then you have to spend your money and your time attacking those rather than just kind of controlling the field.
Yeah, I don't think these two are mutually exclusive. Actually, I think both can be true, and there's probably a lot of interactions there. Public opinion is going to change the space for political proposals about tackling climate change. Political leadership is going to influence public opinion. So, I think it's probably more complex. And so I think both of these things can be true at once. And again, the fact that in this podcast, they are at the same time insisting that they never denied that climate change wasn't happening and saying that they need to spend the time on the policy. It's a sign that they are not comfortable attacking the concept of climate change anymore, or not as comfortable. This is a sort of small victory. I think we often feel, and for good reason, that we're in the sort of reaction position that we're having to sort of fend off this sort of assault on science, the assaults on solutions. But actually, I think from their perspective, this has forced them to act, that they're the ones in the sort of reactionary position.
Let's talk about some of the more colorful individuals in this cohort of climate denialists. You mentioned earlier Jordan Peterson, our old friend. What is the darling of the manosphere doing now as the leading new denialist? And how did that shift happen? And what does that say about the broader group of, it seems to be mostly men, who are involved in the new denial space?
So when we, this can be viewed in the report, when we looked at his channel and how different denialist claims over time had occurred on his channel, what we found was he didn't talk about climate a whole lot, years ago. And it's a relatively recent phenomenon that he has started talking a lot about climate, or his channel has started talking a lot about climate, because we'll have to address the fact that he does a lot of these as interviews, which is a really common format, for promoting this stuff.
Who doesn't like a good interview?
We love an interview. It's a very useful, maybe I'll get to that. It's a very useful format for them, I think. And so we see that he's come to it relatively recently. And when he has, it's mainly consisting of this new denial stuff, with a very minor sliver of this more traditional old denial. And he's largely bringing on other figures to espouse these talking points. And there's this whole thing of sort of lending neutral credibility. A lot of the leading figures who are producing the books, popular books and articles and so on, with the latest climate denialist talking points, they're not actually climate scientists. They've got backgrounds in social science or economics or something like that, typically. So this whole format where Dr. Peterson is interviewing these people, it's part of this. We see it in lots of fields of disinformation, an attempt to sort of give it all a sheen of respectability and authority. And but he expresses it himself. I was actually looking at some of this over the weekend, what some of the, in our data set, some of the transcript snippets of from his channel talking about renewables. And there's a great 20-second clip where he's actually interviewing someone.
I'm going to lay out a few things and tell me if I'm right or wrong. The wind turbines, they're unreliable. They obviously don't work when the wind isn't blowing, which is quite a lot of the time. And that's really a problem at night when the solar panels also don't work. They don't have a proven track record. They only seem to last about 17 years. God, nobody knows what to do with them when they're decommissioned, and they're very expensive to decommission. They're killing whales like mad. Hypothetically, they seem to be really hard on birds. And so this just isn't working out very well. And so now, am I missing something on the wind front? And then we could turn to solar.
No, I think you hit pretty well all of the issues here.
It's not even really a question. So he is expressing this stuff as well.
And the mask fell off a little bit there.
Yeah, I mean, he's actually pretty frank about this stuff.
Yeah.
I mean, but typically the usefulness of this interview format is that you can sort of present these ideas in a much more neutral setting. I mean, I've contrasted with, for example, PragerU,
Mm.
in sort of educational videos. It's very much trying to espouse these views. It's really trying to convince you of them and educate you in them. Whereas this interview format's a bit more sort of neutral looking,
More of my conversation with Callum Hood about the rise of new denialism, how it's spread, and how tech platforms are profiting from it after the break. This episode of Non-Toxic is sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, a Colorado-based company that's been making handcrafted beeswax candles since 1991. Most candles in the market are made of paraffin, a diesel byproduct that's literally scraped from the bottom of the barrel. Blue Corn candles are made from sustainably harvested and lightly filtered beeswax. The candles smell great, burn super slowly, and most importantly, they don't produce any toxic fumes. Blue Corn is running a special deal for non-toxic listeners. Enter the code NONTOXIC, that's one word, all caps, at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Shipping within the US and internationally. So, yeah, let's talk a little bit about the connection between the manosphere and the climate denial movement then. In a previous episode of this podcast, actually, we had an interview with Joe Fassler, who's a journalist for The Guardian, about the big beef messaging campaigns in the US. And one thing that came up is that Jordan Peterson is a frequent speaker at these big ag conferences for beef, and that he himself is a huge advocate of, an all meat diet and all these things.
Yeah.
So what's going on there? Is it just that he went on this personal meat journey and then kind of started getting paid for it and now he's become a climate denialist, or is there some big picture planning going on here?
I think there's a couple of themes in terms of the Peterson worldview or what he's offering young men in particular. One of them's a sort of much more traditional vision of life, a conservative vision of life with a small c, in the sense that things don't need to change. Actually, things were good the way they were. Now, totally other piece with that to say we don't need to disrupt industry or the economy. We don't need to transition to green jobs or greener ways of living. Everything's fine. Fossil fuels are great because they were foundational to this imagined golden age in the past where men were men and women were women and people did traditional gender conforming jobs. So I think it fits with that. And then I think the other thing it fits with is something I see in a number of different types of disinformation on the internet. This sort of guilt-free explanation of things that are matters of anxiety today. So his message is, you don't need to change anything. You don't need to worry about the way you live your life. We don't need to worry about our carbon footprint or, the economy be built on massive carbon emissions. It's all fine. I mean, it's quite a seductive message. And it's a message that he can really align on with some of the leading modern climate deniers, which is that, gas and oil are great. We don't need to worry about this stuff. I mean, it's a very, very reassuring message. We all wish that were true.
One of the things that I noticed reading the report was kind of almost, I want to say, a climate nihilism, that in the new denialism isn't really concerned with saying that climate change isn't real, but saying that the solutions are unworkable. I found that to be particularly depressing because I almost value the bizarro topsy-turvy stuff a little bit more, like that it's all fine. At least there's a sense of optimism buried in there, even if it's, kind of head in the sand, denying reality. But yes, it's real, but we can't do anything about it, or it's too expensive to do anything about it. That is really depressing.
Yeah, so mentioning him a lot in this podcast, John Cook, he was one of the guys involved in making this model. He was also part of a team worked on something called Discourses of Delay, which you may have heard of before. And I read that paper again when I was putting together this report. And it basically covers stuff in that fourth category about solutions not working. They outlined four different ways of doing this. It's things like it's too expensive, you know. And what they say is actually wrong with these arguments is that if climate change, if it is everything we say it is, if it has all the impacts that scientists say it will have, the sort of claim where it's too expensive, it's almost nonsensical, you know, because the cost of doing nothing can't be surpassed. It is a kind of, well, one way to look at it is it's a kind of nihilism. Another way of looking at it is that it's quite a deliberate attempt not to seriously and genuinely engage with the question that climate change poses us, and that there is some kind of dishonesty or deception involved in that. I also spent a lot of time, you know, reading or listening to books by some of the leading modern deniers, people like Bjorn Lomborg. They make lots of arguments in this category. And this category, when you look at our data set, it's the fourth one, and it's the one that grew most. It went from about 1 in 10 claims in 2018 to about 1 in 3 now. And so that is the one that, you know, has received the most attention. And you can see when you go back and look at these books from the last sort of 5 to 10 years, that it's a line of thought that's been actively developed by deniers. And much of it does consist of sort of economical, social arguments as to why solutions just can't work, or even why it's morally wrong actually to pursue solutions.
More of my conversation with Callum after a quick message. We're trying out a new thing here at Non-Toxic, which is to point our listeners towards things we think you guys will like. And in this case, it's a podcast by a good friend of mine, Dr. Carrie McInerney. If you like the discussion of AI in this episode, you'll love Carrie's podcast called The Good Robot. Check it out.
Are you tired of tech bros telling you what to do? Then join us over at The Good Robot Podcast, your one-stop shop for all things gender, feminism, and technology. I'm Dr. Carrie McInerney, and with my co-host, Dr. Eleanor Drage, I'm an AI ethics researcher at the University of Cambridge. On our podcast, we ask, what is good technology? Is it even possible? And how can feminism help us work towards it? So find us over on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, or wherever else you get your podcasts.
Now back to my conversation with Callum. Let's talk about this conversation between Jordan Peterson and Alex Epstein, who is one of the leading climate deniers. He's a big fossil fuel proponent, but he kind of wears the cloak of someone in favor of developing countries, and he wants developing countries and the people there to experience the same quality of life as people in the global north. And how dare environmentalists try to deny them? Actually, environmentalists are a bunch of genocidal white supremacists who are trying to, you know, engage in some sort of like global population control experiment. That's like where the argument ends. This is Epstein being interviewed by Jordan Peterson.
Those people are not making that evaluation by anything resembling the goal of advancing human flourishing on Earth. They are pursuing, to a significant degree, this goal of eliminating human impact on Earth. One of the people I pick on very deservedly in Fossil Future is Michael Mann, who's a climate scientist and activist who is one of the leading advisors. And if you look at Michael Mann's statements, one thing he has said is the ideal population for Earth is 1 billion people. Yeah. How can you possibly say that? There are 8 billion people. Like, how can you possibly look at Earth and say, oh yeah, it's too many people? That has a murderous impulse to it. If you just look at the Earth and you say, oh yeah, 7 billion people should go.
And I find that really fascinating because it's like, this is a group of people who could not care less about the lives of people in the global south. But they, like, clearly they notice that this is actually a powerful argument. Like, oh yeah, like we shouldn't, you know, imperil the lives of billions of people via climate change. People respond to that argument because of the moral valence of it. but they just like kind of take that and flip it upside down and say, no, it's the environmentalists who are denying the rights of the people of the global south to live a flourishing and happy life.
The moral question posed by climate change about how the burden is shared unequally, about the misery it would unleash, particularly on the most vulnerable and some of the poorest parts of the world, you're not really engaging with that question in a serious way if your ultimate answer is business as usual. And they are very, very reliant upon economic arguments that radically mark down the economic and human cost of climate change. So it's a notorious issue in the economics of climate change that it's obviously, it's a hard thing to measure, but that typically economists have radically underpriced the cost of climate change and what it will do to economies. But they sort of rely on that weakness in the field to make arguments that actually we'd all be economically better off if climate change is allowed to proceed as normal. We'll take haircut on our GDP globally, but that's fine. I mean, first of all, what does a 5%, 10% haircut to our GDP globally look like? I mean, it doesn't sound like a lot, but even on that measure, that is chaos and misery. I think these are really weak arguments, actually, and their foundation is this moral argument, the practicalities argument. A lot of it's built on pretty shaky economics, I think.
Yeah, I think the problem is that most listeners or readers are not really equipped to see through the fallacies that are, the shaky supports.
Yeah. There's a lot of anecdotes as well in these books. There's a lot of little anecdotes about this or that attempted project to build solar or, wind or hydropower in developing countries, and it didn't work in this case. Fair enough, and where it hasn't worked, lessons have to be learned. But it's trying to make an emotional appeal.
Speaking of emotional appeals, here's an episode from Glenn Beck's channel on YouTube.
They don't care about saving the planet. They know that climate change is not going to kill millions around the world. No, this is all about gaining power and control over you. And climate change, much like COVID, is their current ticket to get there. They're using this so-called emergency to justify a reset, and it must be stopped because it's nothing more than national suicide for any country that follows this evil plan. And in some corners of the world, that destruction has already begun.
Sri Lanka, the country is in the grip of a massive political and economic crisis. Nearly 5 million people, that is 22% of the population right now, need food aid.
Tonight, I'll show you how Europe is following in Sri Lanka's footsteps and how the United States will be next. Tonight, the path to control.
And to a particular kind of reader as well. I mean, I think this is ultimately intended to persuade people who are inclined to be worried about climate change. So again,
which is most people.
Which is most people now. So it marks this shift away from just trying to sort of brute force people by saying climate change just is not happening. And now it's an attempt to sort of redirect people's concerns about climate change, and they're thinking about, well, what the hell do we do about this? This is really difficult. The arguments vary as to whether you can go much more slowly. They often have a bit of a sop to climate change is important, and tackling it is important as well. But there's radicals out there trying to make us go too fast on these things. But actually, this stuff is grounded in the science, and where the science says we'll end up in, a matter of years if we don't do anything.
I want to end our conversation talking a little bit about the larger kind of information ecosystem and the tech platforms that are really undergirding all of this. They're spreading this disinformation and circulating it and profiting from it. It's my understanding that many tech platforms already have rules about spreading misinformation online. So, why should people be worried about new denial if it's already covered under these policies?
So interestingly, it's basically not covered by any policies on any platform at the moment. So Google, who owns YouTube and sets their policies and was the subject of our study, to their credit, they have one of the stronger policies on climate disinformation. They came out a few years ago now and said, we're not going to allow monetization of content that denies the established scientific consensus about the existence of and the human causes of climate change. Now, we've done lots of work to check whether they're enforcing that policy and whether it's on videos or whether it's ads running on denialist websites or whether it's Google actually just running ads that promote denialism on Google search results. We found them fail again and again and again. There's been a small amount of progress, but not much. So the sort of argument that we make towards the end of our report is, well, if that's legit, which we believe it is, this is a limited policy about monetization. It's not stopping anyone posting anything. And we're talking about the subclass that are really clearly disinformation consensus. So what we're saying now is, well, why not also apply that policy to stuff that contradicts the established scientific consensus about the impacts of climate change or about the solutions to climate change? Why not have a policy about abuse of climate scientists, So, which would be a separate thing, slightly distinct. But there is this sort of logical extension of the policy you can do. Now, most other platforms, TikTok has now some policies on this, and there's been some work showing that they don't seem to be particularly actively enforcing policies on this. So there is a long way to go on this. I mean, I think there's a very, very interesting question. I remember during the early days of the COVID pandemic, and we were doing a lot of work on COVID misinformation. And as is sort of culturally normal for these big tech platforms, they were being very slow to introduce any new policies on this. It often looks as if they're just sort of slow-witted, but it's a deliberate strategy, really. I mean, they want to pick up as few policies as possible. They want as few limits on themselves as possible in terms of what content they've got drawing people to their platform and what content is then having ads served on it that they can earn more money from. I was looking through testimony from Frances Haugen, the whistleblower, yesterday, and she said in her time at Facebook, they were unwilling to make even minuscule policy changes that would mean that they missed out on a sliver of profit, was her words. So, but I remember that the arguments over whether they would need a COVID policy and the bar that they were setting, and I think this is often implicit in these discussions about platform standards, but isn't made explicit often enough. And it's that, first of all, it needs to be demonstrably false, and it has to be harmful. And actually, the bar that most platforms put there is actually beyond harmful, risk of imminent harm. And that's the bar they set. Now, of course, this is a really interesting question when you apply it to climate change.
Yeah, that doesn't work as well. Obviously, COVID, you can get the disease and you can get sick and die within a matter of days or weeks. Climate change, we're talking about years, decades.
Yeah.
And what constitutes imminent then?
Exactly. So in terms of harm, it is arguably the biggest sort of harm in the offing, to all mankind. How imminent it is a question, but scientists tell us there'll be pretty bad consequences now and more soon if we fail to do anything. But you can see why it doesn't map on particularly well to the ways platforms typically think of this. But look, our sort of priority would be there's a lot of progress to be made on trying to knock out some of the ways in which platforms actively promote this stuff. So one of them is to hand over cash to people who produce engaging climate denialist content where it is contradicting the scientific consensus, where everybody who has anything worth saying can tell you this stuff is just false. And there's also stuff about amplification as well. So we've done some work on X/Twitter in the last year, looking at how climate denialism is going there when all the safeties are taken off. And we
should also note that Elon Musk is currently suing the Center for Countering Digital Hate.
Yes, you should note that. Yeah, that we did some work on hate on X, and he's decided to take us to court over that, saying that, breach of terms of service and things like this. So it's a really important case in terms of the right to be able to study these platforms. But we see
But
on
then
X
in a separate matter, you're also looking at the climate denial.
Yeah.
happening on X.
We've done a whole series of projects looking at X, and we found that after Musk took over, the volume of tweets mentioning climate scam went up radically. That denialist accounts were growing twice as fast in terms of followers, and that when they introduced $8 blue ticks, that your $8 blue ticks spread a lot more misinformation than your old legacy verified blue ticks. So it's become a much more amenable platform for denialism, and that's a sign of what happens when a platform backslides on this stuff, and why we, organizations like Center for Countering Digital Hate, why we need to push for better standards.
So what can listeners do when it comes to action?
Just two main things that we'd like people to take away from the report if they're really interested in climate. And one of them is, some useful information, hopefully, about how this argument is. You don't necessarily have to convince people of every axiom of the science on climate change and the solutions. You just need to get them on board with taking action. So I think our report says this fight is now over the solutions. I think sometimes we have in our heads, like we've got to walk people through right from point zero to here's all the science on, the greenhouse effect, and here's why it's human caused, and here's why this is the solution as the science behind that. And we've got to get them up this mountain one step at a time. And only at the end of it might they go, oh, okay, I'll take whatever action, whether it's, back in some project low. Actually, you can skip to the end. All people have to believe is that these climate policies are good for us, and that's where the fight is. So I think that's one thing. And then the other thing is that the social media policies on this matter. At the moment they are actively supporting the generation of stuff. It's the think tanks who have shown that they're bad faith for decade or more in some cases. That they at every turn have been putting obstacles in front of taking climate change seriously, even if they now claim that they never denied that climate change wasn't happening. And they're actually able to earn a buck in some cases off YouTube for posting this stuff. And the more controversial and wacky it is, and the more damaging or sensational it is, the better in their view, and the more money they could possibly earn. So one thing we can do is advocate for changes to these platforms that will have a whole range of benefits in terms of protecting civil liberties, protecting the underpinnings of democracy, and making sure that we're not making these decisions based on horrendous, self-indulgent untruths.
Callum, thank you so much for joining Non-Toxic, and thank you for the dogged work that you all do at the Center for Countering Digital Hate. It's always a pleasure to talk to you and get your insights.
It was great to be back. Really nice to talk to you again.
Disinformation. What do we do about it? On an individual level, there are only so many posts that you can report or block, right? It's really up to the tech companies, and ultimately even more the governments who ostensibly regulate the tech companies, to put an end to the spread of climate disinfo. And that means, as Callum rightly points out, demonetizing people who are literally making a buck spreading lies, as well as preventing the algorithms from juicing the numbers for people who are undermining public understanding perhaps the most essential issue that we face. It's not just our actual ecosystems that matter, but our information ecosystems too. And that's it for this episode of Non-Toxic. Non-Toxic is produced by Loose Thread Studios with help from Andrew Lewis. Our music is by Nathan Sharp, and our artwork is by Sam Creasy. We're sponsored by Blue Corn Candles, but our most important sponsors are listeners like you. If you'd like to keep detoxifying the discourse, go to patreon.com/non-toxic-podcast and sign up to become a patron today. And of course, you can find our newsletter at Substack, our socials on IG, and don't forget to spread the word. Non-Toxic only fulfills its mission if more people listen.